Hey everyone, this is Cortland Dahl. So great to join you all. I've been looking forward to this for a little bit here. I'm here in Madison, Wisconsin. For those of you who don't know me, as I said, my name is Cortland. I'm an instructor for the Tergar meditation community, and really happy to have you here for some discussion about meditation, some teachings from the Buddhist tradition, and a little bit of meditation practice. So I can see already a bunch of you are chiming in from around the world. If you haven't done so already, feel free to say who you are and say hi in the chat box, maybe where you're from. And I can see that there's people from all over the world. Joma from Dharamsala. Hey, Joma. Got Camila from all the way from Rio, a bunch of you in the US, Iowa, Colorado, New York, Miami, Canada, Vancouver, Australia. Wow, must be very early for you there. Yeah, from all over the place, Malaysia. So many of you joining from all over the world. So it's wonderful to have you here for a Tergar live stream. For those of you who may be tuning in to this channel for the first time, we've been holding weekly meditation practices and teachings, and they're all really centered around giving us the tools and the insights so we can find some balance, some inner calm, perhaps even a way to connect with others in a compassionate way in this incredibly challenging time. So technology can oftentimes play a damaging role in our life, but this is one of these times where it can bring us together. And even though we are all over the world, I can see so many of you are still saying hi here. Another Galton Dechen in New Zealand, Vancouver, California. So again, so many of you around the world. It's great to have you with us. So I thought I'd just say a couple words to get us started here, and then maybe we could do a little bit of meditation practice. And throughout the session, throughout this this time here together tonight, you feel free to put any questions or comments that you want in the live chat here. And Kirstine is on our side, who's monitoring that and can keep track of these questions. So there's plenty of time for some Q&A if anything comes up that you'd like to ask about. But maybe I'll just say a couple words and then we can take a few minutes to settle in. So the first thing I thought I'd start us off with is just a very basic principle. This is coming from the earliest teachings of Buddhism. In fact, one of the very first teachings that the Buddha himself ever gave 2,500 years ago, where he started. Actually, the first things he taught were orienting people and all of us as humans to how pervasive suffering is in our lives. And that so many of the challenges, the problems we face is due to this kind of chronic dissatisfaction that can plague the human mind. And there can be times like this where things are very obviously off, where we might be suffering a lot. It could be our physical health. It could be something with work. It could be something with family. There's so many different things happening right now that are incredibly challenging. But even when times are good, there can still be this very subtle nagging quality in our mind that is somehow always looking around the corner for something better. We always have this expectation that the future should be better than what we have right now. And what happens when this becomes a habit of the mind, and it very much does for many of us, is almost as though we become blind to the richness of who we are and what we are in this present moment, to what we have in this present moment. So even in these really challenging times and all of the uncertainty, all of the upheaval that we have in our lives right now, there is the possibility of seeing qualities of our own experience that normally get missed, that we simply lose track of. And when we don't know how to look anymore, we don't know how to see these qualities of our own mind, it can feel as though they're not there. So a sense of ease, a sense of calm, a sense of deep connection with the people in our lives and the world around us, a sense of meaning and purpose. We start thinking that these are things that are lacking, and we need to find them in some new and better experience than the one we're actually having. And we end up in this perpetual chase. This is what Buddhists call samsara. It's the cycle in which we are always looking outside of ourselves and outside of this moment for true contentment, to finally feel at home in our lives, to feel at home in our own bodies and our own skin. And for me, this is really what drove me to the practice of meditation, and eventually to start learning about Buddhism, was really a basic discomfort, not only with my life, but with myself, I would say. I had a tremendous amount of anxiety, and in particular, social situations were really stressful and overwhelming at times. This is now 30 years ago, when I was a teenager and starting college, and I was just overwhelmed. I didn't feel comfortable with myself. I didn't feel comfortable with my life. I didn't feel comfortable with my emotions. I was always finding flaw with myself, with the world, with my experience. There was always something that needed to be fixed. So what these teachings call us to do is to see that this is a habit of our own minds. We have become addicted to dissatisfaction. We've become addicted to only seeing the flaws and the shortcomings. But that, as depressing as that might sound at first, that was the end of the story. That would be incredibly depressing. But that's the beginning. It's almost starting by diagnosing what the issue is and being honest with ourselves, being honest with our culture, with our world. This is what's happening. We are taught, we are programmed to see ourselves as deficient. And we need to see that clearly as a starting point. But once we see it clearly, then we can start to reorient our mind. Instead of focusing on our perceived shortcomings, we can start to see that even in a situation like this, where so much is going wrong, even here, there are things that are fundamentally wholesome and good and pure about our own minds, about our own experience, and about the world. Everybody, everything has these very basic, wholesome qualities. In Buddhist terms, we call this Buddha nature, that our nature is fundamentally good, and we just have forgotten how to see it. And this is not so helpful as a theory. If this is just a new belief system, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good. We need to train ourselves to look. We need to train our minds to see ourselves more clearly, rather than through this distorting lens of chronic dissatisfaction and habitually seeing our shortcomings and the shortcomings of the world. So that's not to say there aren't problems that need to be addressed. It's not to say there aren't real things going on that we need to focus on. But we can come to that. We can address and engage all of these issues, whether it's a personal thing or, as we have right now, something going on across the entire planet. We can do that grounded in a view of ourselves in which we feel complete. We feel whole instead of deficient. We feel complete instead of always feeling that something is lacking. So meditation, at least in this tradition, there's many kinds of meditation, but at least in this tradition, meditation is not just about stilling the mind. It certainly isn't about emptying your mind of thoughts and not having any thoughts or feelings. It's simply learning to turn the mind to examine experience so that we can see these qualities of ourselves that have always been there, but that we've just learned, we've been programmed to become blind to. So this is essentially what we're doing on the path of meditation. So why don't we actually do it together? Why don't we start with a little bit of meditation? If you're completely new to this, I'll guide us step by step. And some of you are probably seasoned meditators, and you can follow along here as well, or do whatever practice you're used to doing. But in any case, why don't we jump in here and do a bit of practice together and see what comes of that. And then I'll say a few more words. So take a moment to check in with your posture. This is a great starting point. Notice how your body feels right now. You can close your eyes if you like, or keep them gently open, whatever feels more natural. And as you settle into a comfortable posture, take a few slow, calming breaths. And as you do this, notice how the air feels as it moves in and out of your body. And now take a moment to reflect on your motivation for listening to this tonight, for doing this short meditation, and see if you can find an inspiring, open-hearted, compassionate motivation to guide your practice. You might even think to yourself, I am now going to meditate not only for myself, but to help everyone, everywhere, find true and lasting happiness and well-being. So you can use whatever words, images, or phrases resonate with you, but take a moment to find that compassionate, uplifted motivation. And once you've connected with that motivation, let's move back into mindful awareness. And in particular, the practice of what we call open awareness. So for this, drop all the effort. You don't need to focus or concentrate. You can drop all the doing energy that builds up in your body and mind, and simply be. Give yourself permission to truly take a break and rest your mind and your body, and just simply be present in this moment. If it helps, you can continue to notice the breath, notice the feelings in your body, perhaps in your nose or your abdomen as your breath moves in and out. But here with a very, very gentle, almost effortless awareness, not really trying to focus or concentrate, just being. And see if you can be open and accepting of whatever is happening within you and around you in this moment. It does not matter at all if your mind is busy and agitated or calm and peaceful. If your body is tense or relaxed. Just be who you are, as you are in this moment. And just notice what's happening. Be open to it. And now from this place of effortless, open awareness, gently notice different aspects of your experience right now. Not with intention to change or improve or fix anything, but to explore it deeply. So start with your body. You can move your awareness through your body and notice what you find. Where do you feel the most sensation in your body right now? Bring your awareness to that part of your body and notice what it feels like. It doesn't matter if it's pleasant sensation or unpleasant or neutral. Just notice. Just let your awareness rest on these sensations. And you'll probably notice that your mind will wander away, wander into thoughts, into distraction. That is perfectly normal. So the practice is to notice when that happens. And when you notice it, you can gently return your attention to your body. Continue to notice what sensations are present in your body. Just pick up where you left off and keep going. And now shift your awareness to what you hear. And again, you don't need to focus too intensely. You can almost imagine sound is like a wave that is rolling up on the shore. Let it come to you. Let it move through your awareness. And simply notice whatever sounds come and go as you sit here and meditate. So your attention will be moving here and there as you do this practice, as it does all the time in life. And here it doesn't matter so much where your attention is, it is the quality of awareness, this panoramic knowing quality that is always present. And it's bigger than mere attention. It's not just that flashlight of attention. It is simply the fact that you are here. You are experiencing this moment. So we're just tapping into that quality of being. In this case, being within that space of awareness, resting in awareness. And now, before we conclude the meditation, I'd like to shift gears for a moment and do a short reflection. One of the most essential points of this practice of meditation is cultivating the ability to shift our perspective, to see things in a new way, with fresh eyes, so to speak. So take a moment to reflect on your life these days. I think all of us are oftentimes focused on what we wish were different, what we wish we could change, what we don't like. But instead, I'd like to ask you to think about what is meaningful to you these days. What might have even happened as a result of this pandemic that has been linked to some feeling of meaning, perhaps to a deeper sense of purpose or to an important personal value. So take a moment to find something specific that has been meaningful as a result of this challenging situation. See if you can savor the sense of meaning that comes to mind. Bring it into focus so you can see it clearly. Perhaps even think of the next day or two, where you'll be, what you'll be doing, who you'll be with. How could you bring this perspective of seeing what is meaningful, seeing what you value, seeing what is linked to a deeper sense of purpose? Think of the situations that you'll find yourself in over the next day or two and see if you could imagine what it might be like to bring this perspective into those situations. Okay, let's let go of the reflection now and take just a few moments to rest and open awareness. Again, let go of all the mental effort. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are right now. Feel whatever you're feeling right now. Take a few slow, deep breaths again. And slowly open your eyes if they were closed. And take in the richness of this moment. Maybe just look around. Notice some small details that you don't ordinarily notice about the world around you. And as we continue on, I'd love to hear what came up for you in that meditation practice. If you want to share, especially anything that you thought of when you reflected on things that might be meaningful, values, a deeper sense of purpose, anything that you want to share in the chat box. I'd love to hear what came to mind when you did that. And especially, this does not have to be any remarkable, huge thing. It could just be very simple things. What I thought of actually was that I'm here with my wife and my son. And I normally, in my normal day-to-day life before this, I would see them in the morning, at night when I get home, but I get to see them in these small moments throughout the day, and we spend time together. And that's something that I normally don't get to experience. And it's a gift. Of course, I wish we weren't in the middle of this pandemic, but there are some really beautiful moments that some of us might not have experienced otherwise. So I'd love to hear what came up for you in the practice. If you want to share anything, any thoughts, or just how you're feeling right now, or what came up for you when you're doing that meditation, feel free to put it in the live chat, and can share with others your own perspective and insights. And maybe I'll just share a few more thoughts. I started off, before we did that meditation, talking about this idea of really getting in touch with our own experience and getting real with ourselves, getting honest with ourselves. We need to start with seeing ourselves clearly. And from that sense of clarity, from that willingness to be honest and to look openly at our experience, we can then begin to think about what new perspective we might want to bring to bear. So I can see some of you already adding a comment. Sibele in Rio wrote appreciation. The opportunity to connect with people through technology. That's something that I really feel a lot. If you can imagine what this world would be like right now without technology, I think we'd be feeling so much more isolated. So I think Larry mentions feeling a stronger connection to Tergar and Mingyur Rinpoche, who is the guiding teacher in this community. Beth wrote that giving one's time can be so meaningful, which is so true. And Angela wrote gratitude, beautiful. So thank you so much. So a lot of this is, I think, what you're doing and what you're mentioning right now, just watching these comments coming in, what's happening, and actually what you're mentioning, those of you who are putting this into the chat right now, you're giving voice to that shift in perspective. So we start, as the Buddha counseled us 2,500 years ago, to notice how often we are not satisfied. We want the world to be different. We want ourselves to be different. We want our minds to be different, our emotions to be different. We want everything to be different. We are addicted to what we don't like, to seeing, I should say, what we don't like. And that becomes this chronic cycle. So the beginning point is just to see that. But by seeing that, we can then begin to shift our perspective. So even what Mario, hope I'm pronouncing your name right, where you just wrote that you had an astonishing recognition that you were being too harsh on yourself. I mean, we are so harsh on ourselves, actually. We are so critical. Even in the best of times, we are almost constantly dwelling on things that need to be fixed, things that need to be improved. So in some of the work that I do, some of you might know that I teach meditation and I do stuff like this. I also work as a scientist at the Center for Healthy Minds in the University of Wisconsin. And just today, I was reading some really, really fascinating research, and it was about resilience, how we can deal with really difficult times. And what the research shows is that, I mean, it shows something that I think is quite intuitive and we all know from our own experience. There are times when we face challenges and we get completely overwhelmed by them. So I remember, as I mentioned, all the anxiety I had when I was in my late teens and early 20s. I was completely paralyzed by that. I didn't know what to do. I had no tools. I didn't know how to work with it. I didn't feel like I could talk to anybody about it. I just didn't know what to do. I was just overwhelmed by it. And that sense of being overwhelmed, especially when it continued, it was crippling. So we can have these times where difficulty overwhelms us and we get lost, we get overpowered by it. But we can also, if we look back on our lives, and some of us may be experiencing this now, we also have moments where we have an incredibly difficult situation. And it's not that it gets easy. Difficulties, challenges are never fun. You know, anybody who tells you a major global crisis is going to be fun is maybe not really paying attention. Challenges are challenges. They're difficult. Pain is pain. Sickness is sickness. Loss is loss. That's never fun. But there are times when we can have these challenges, and instead of being overwhelmed by them, they can be sources of deep, deep insight and growth. They can be times where we really learn about ourselves. They can be times where we forge stronger and deeper connections with our community. Or as Beth wrote in the chat, there are times where we can see how giving, even in the middle of a crisis, how giving, how sharing, how volunteering, or helping however we can, how incredibly rewarding that can be. So what the research I was looking at today was showing was very interesting. Actually, it was two different papers. And one paper was people who had experienced one or more experiences of extreme trauma earlier in their lives. The other paper was a study of earthquake survivors in Pakistan. And they were looking at what happened with these people who experienced different kinds of childhood trauma on the one hand, or in this other case, a natural disaster, an earthquake. And what they found was that some people, like I just mentioned, and we all know from our lives, some of those people really got overwhelmed, and in some cases even developed clinical depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. Other people actually demonstrated resilience and were able to bounce back. So we've all been on both sides of this. We've all been on the overwhelmed side, and we've all been on the other side as well. But what was really interesting about this particular research, which is very important for this discussion of how we deal with this chronic dissatisfaction, is that it was a sense of meaning and purpose that predicted whether people were overwhelmed and ended up experiencing, even psychological distress, even disorders, or on the other hand, actually were resilient and experienced what scientists call post-traumatic growth, where they looked back on these terrible, difficult experiences, but looking back on them felt that they had learned and grown through their adversity. So the take-home message from this is not so much that we should want a life where we never experience hardship, a life where we don't experience pain and loss, when we don't have uncertainty. We are never going to have that life. That is part of life. But what we can do, and this was, again, back to one of the central perspectives of the Buddhist teachings, is that there are things that are out of our control. And usually when we're overwhelmed, we are focused on the things we cannot control. Instead, we can focus on what we can control, even in a crisis, even in a really difficult situation. And what we always have control over is our perspective. So what you all just did, and I can see this, I'm reading the comments right now. There's so many great comments here. We can learn to see things clearly, and we can focus, we can reorient our mind, we can shift our perspective to see things in a different way. Instead of only seeing the flaws and the shortcomings, instead of seeing things as a meaningless void, we can start to see that there is a deep sense of meaning, even in challenges, even in the mundane details of life. Of course, the peak moments of life are meaningful. That's obvious. But what we find is even in the most challenging lives, an earthquake survivor who can look back and say, that was terrible, it was awful, but I learned and I grew so much. My relationships are stronger because of that. So the question is, oftentimes we experience that wise perspective years later. Sometimes it's decades later. I can look back now, 20 years, 25 years later. What is that? Yeah, 28 years later. And I can look back on that 20-year-old version of me and say, I'm so grateful that I felt that anxiety. If I hadn't had crippling anxiety, I would have never learned to meditate. I would have never have sought out the practice of meditation. So now I feel grateful and I look back on that, but I did not feel that then. I did not have that perspective then. Nobody taught me how to shift my perspective then. So the question is, how can we shift our perspective to have that wise perspective, that wisdom mind? How can we bring that into now? How can we bring that when we are actually facing the challenging situation, not just something we're going to have 10 years from now, when we look back in this pandemic and said, yeah, that was a wake-up call for humanity. The entire planet needed a jolt. Actually, the planet did not need a jolt. Humanity needed a jolt. We needed a shock to the system because we were not listening to the signs. We were not listening to the signs in the environment. We were not listening to all the division, the alienation that was happening in our social relationships. We weren't listening. And we needed something to shock us. Maybe we'll think that 10 years from now. But how can we see some of that now? And not just seeing the negativity in that, but to see that this is an incredible opportunity for every one of us, for the entire planet. This is an incredible opportunity. That is not to say it is going to be pleasant and fun. It very obviously is not going to be pleasant and fun. But how can we make the most of what we're facing right now? Individually, collectively, as a community, as a society, as a planet, as a species, how can we really use this to bring out our wisdom and compassion, not our neurosis? So part of this starts with simply seeing that we have that old habit of mind that is just going to get us focusing on the negative over and over again. And when you see that clearly, you can start to see that we have so many things that are reinforcing that old habit of mind. So many things are orienting us towards the negative. They're getting us laser focused and hyper focused on the fear, on the division, on what everybody else is doing wrong, on what everybody else should be doing differently. The problem is everybody thinks that. So everybody is pointing the finger out there. And as long as it's always out there, nothing will change. Nobody has a monopoly on the truth. Nobody has the perfect understanding of any of this. We're all fumbling through this. Certainly some of us more than others, but we're all figuring this out. I certainly don't have any answers to this. I'm having a hard enough time figuring out how to help my son get through school right now. Forget about, a global pandemic. So we're all in this together. We are all doing our best. We are all making mistakes along the way. And we need to pull together here and see that even the people who think differently than we do, even the people who are coming to different conclusions, who we're sure are doing the wrong thing, we need to start seeing the common humanity we share. There needs to be some kind of unilateral disarmament of our own aggression. And it starts with ourselves, of simply being a little kinder, a little gentler, a little more understanding of ourselves, giving ourselves a little more slack. So in Buddhism, and Mingyur Rinpoche, for those of you who watched on Sunday, you would have heard Mingyur Rinpoche talk about this. The very core teachings are what we call the Four Noble Truths. It starts with an acceptance of this chronic dissatisfaction, the chronic suffering that can come from always wanting things to be different than what they are. And then we can start to see that a lot of this is based in our perspective. We have aversion to some things, we get attached to other outcomes, and we're in this constant tug of war with experience where things are never quite right. The way I like to think of this is it's like we have these volume knobs on our lives, on experience, and we're always tweaking the volume. It's never quite right. This is going to be one of these generational things for any of you who are not probably in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or beyond, but an old radio station where we're kind of like trying to get the station just right, and it's always a little staticky. It never quite comes in. We oftentimes manage our lives like that. We're just trying to make subtle adjustments. Or sometimes we want to throw the whole thing out and start over, but it's never here. It's never enough. We are never enough for ourselves. So it's shifting that perspective, seeing the meaning that is already here, seeing the presence, seeing awareness, seeing the basic innate compassion and kindness that we have. It's very subtle. It's not as obvious as all the bells and whistles of the newscast and the Twitter feed and all of that stuff. It's subtle. But when you pay attention to it, it is so incredibly nourishing because it short circuits that constant nagging feeling that it's never enough. We finally have a break where we can actually feel whole and comfortable with who we are and what we are. And that is what gives us the inner resources to address the challenges of the world. It doesn't make us tuned out. It doesn't make us kind of say, oh, everything's just wonderful. I don't need to do anything. We're seeing clearly, but we're coming to the challenges of the world with a full heart, with a fullness of being, not an emptiness in our core. We're feeling full, that we have enough to give, to offer. So this is just the beginning. As we go further, and we'll talk about this in subsequent sessions, I think Mingyur Rinpoche is going to say more about this as well. We start to see this clearly. We learn to shift our perspective, and we can start seeing these old habits of mind that get us caught in that loop of chronic dissatisfaction. And then we start to see that there is a new possibility. The possibility of really feeling at home in the world is possible. Not only is it possible, but it's something that never asks us to feel different than what we're feeling, to be someone different than who we are, to have a different experience than what we're having. We can tap into these qualities. And this is, again, what meditation is all about. We can train ourselves like we've been trained to be dissatisfied and anxious. We can train ourselves to just shift our perspective. That moment when you bring awareness to your breath, or right now you feel your feet on the floor, you take a slow, calming breath, and then you just let yourself be. You can do this right now as you're listening. You're just coming home, coming back to this idea that who and what you are right now is enough. We don't have to endlessly beat ourselves up. We don't have to constantly be on this quest to improve that we will never reach the end of. It's a marathon that never ends. It's a game we can never win. So that seeing the possibility of a different way of doing this whole thing, of being human, is the third noble truth. We call it technically the truth of cessation, but it's simply the possibility of a radically different way of being in the world and in our lives than what we've been used to a lot of the time. And the fourth noble truth is just that there is a path. This is not a belief system. It's not something you accept or reject as some new theory about life. It's not a philosophy. It's a practice. It's something we can learn. So meditation is a big piece of this. Becoming more sensitive to how we live our lives, to live a life of nonviolence and compassion, and to learning to see clearly, to simply be willing to look honestly and realistically at our own mind and our own experience. So why don't I pause here? I've said quite a bit, and I think there's been a lot of questions coming in. So maybe I'll see what some of you have written in here. So one question was that sometimes it feels like suffering is unfair. And how should we look at our ideas of fairness and unfairness? So that's a really great question. And I think part of it is that our minds go into this sort of mode of trying to figure things out and assess and judge. And it's a helpful thing that the mind does that. A lot of the great breakthroughs and science, the insights, great works of art come from this mind that's just generating ideas and trying to figure things out. The reality is that samsara is messy. It does not make sense. Sometimes we do the right thing and we suffer. Sometimes we do the wrong thing and somehow things go okay. There are plenty of examples. We could look around the world of people who seem to be pretty hell-bent on either at the very least just getting their own well-being or working for themselves, and sometimes might be actively harming people and somehow seem to get away with it. It doesn't make sense. There's not a logic to it. So the trying to figure that out, again, I think that's kind of part of it's understandable that we want to figure it out. On the other hand, it doesn't serve a constructive role. It doesn't lead us to a place where we can feel that. I think what I would say is a helpful thing to use that energy of the mind. So the mind is doing its kind of investigation and analysis. It's assessing things. It's trying to figure things out. Looking out there, looking at some person or some situation and saying, well, why are they experiencing that? And this other person, didn't deserve that. We're probably not going to be able to figure that out. But we can use that wisdom, because that is part of the wisdom mind. It's that capacity to investigate, to inquire. We can look at our own mind in life, not with a sense of judgment, but with a sense of curiosity. And not with a sense of trying to make these kind of black and white categorizations of it's fair or it's unfair, but simply using that wisdom of the curious mind to start to see more clearly. And this is the key point that I would say about this. The important thing is not the end point of that looking, of coming to the answer of it. It's the willingness to keep looking. It's the willingness to keep inquiring, to noticing, to examining, with this, again, with a sense of curiosity, not with a sense of right, wrong, good, bad, yes, no. And when that becomes the habit, it's sort of like using the best part of that wisdom, inquiring, curious mind, but without the rigidity that can creep in when we want the right answer or we want the solution that we think is right. So we can just keep investigating, but especially be looking at our own experience, not always pointing it out there, which is our habit, but looking at our own mind. What happens when I have this perspective versus that perspective? What happens with this action or this way of speaking versus that one? Just examine, be the explorer of your own experience. And then that same curiosity can be so incredibly rewarding. So another question, Christian wrote, what are the best methods of correcting motivation during meditation? and how to avoid the pitfalls of spiritual materialism along the path. Wow, that's another great question. So in the Tibetan tradition, actually motivation is said to be more important than anything else in your practice. So starting as we did tonight, actually at the beginning of our meditation, where we come back to compassionate motivation, that if we start with compassion, if we start with altruism and wanting this to be not only for ourselves, but to be of benefit to others, to help others, whether directly or indirectly, that itself will short circuit any of the ways that the ego and the grasping mind can start clinging and getting caught up in expectations and having an agenda for what should or should not be happening. So I think the key is to come back again and again and again, not only in meditation, but throughout your day, to very, very simply a compassionate wish to want to be of benefit, to want to be of service. So one thing that I often do, for example, I oftentimes have a lot of meetings in my day. I try to pause between meetings and just simply ground myself for a moment in that motivation. I'm going to be talking to these people about this topic. May whatever I bring into that, may it be of benefit to them. And may what we do together in this meeting, may it help us to benefit others. I might not know what that would look like, but whatever happens, may it be beneficial to others. And with my meditation in particular, one thing I found especially helpful is I oftentimes will think to myself, may whatever happens in this meditation be what will serve others and serve the world, even if my mind is a distracted mess for the next half hour. If that somehow is what's going to be better for the world, then may my mind be a distracted mess. If it's better for me to be focused and calm, may I be focused and calm. May whatever happens be what will serve the well-being of others most effectively. So I think when you come back to that compassionate motivation, and I think in a way your question itself kind of answers it, is coming back to that wholesome motivation. If you're rooted in a kind, caring, compassionate motivation, it does not matter if your mind is totally distracted or focused, if you have the best meditation or the best day of your life or the most challenging. As long as we can stay connected to that motivation, things will be wholesome. And ultimately, over time, the cumulative effect of that compassion will end up being deeply, deeply transformative, much more so than oftentimes what we think we want to happen when we have an idea of what should or should not be happening in our meditation practice, or even broadly in our life. So another one, a very practical question from Sandy wrote, what are some good books to start off with when starting to study Buddhism? So I probably can't answer this question without saying The Joy of Living, which is a book by Mingyur Rinpoche. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say I'm probably the least unbiased person on the planet as far as that question, but I really do think it's one of the best books. I wish I had had it when I first started meditating. The books that I read that were deeply transformative for me, I really, really benefited from Jon Kabat-Zinn's books. In particular, Wherever You Go, There You Are was one of the first books I read. And it was so profoundly inspiring to me. That was definitely one of the books that changed my life. Jack Kornfield wrote a book called A Path with Heart. That was another one that for me was really, really inspiring. So those are just a few. Actually, on the Tergar website, I think there's a top 10 books for new meditators. There's another one that says top 10 books for those who are curious about Buddhism. So you might check that out as well. But those are a few really great books. So let's see here. So another question this is from Jackson. How can we balance being gentle and kind with ourselves with self-discipline? That's another profound question. So strangely, I think one way to look at it would be that healthy self-discipline is being kind and caring towards ourselves. And being kind and caring towards ourselves, truly kind and caring with wisdom, also will necessarily involve some self-discipline. So especially early on, I think there's sort of having some boundaries. And the way I always tend to look at this is kind of looking at finding a healthy balance in life and in practice. Because usually we're too tight, too loose. We have a lot of expectations. We're kind of maybe too lax. And finding that middle ground is really, really challenging. So one thing that I found really helpful is, one, to just know that being on either side of that boundary is part of finding the middle. So when we might be a little too tight and we push ourselves too hard, and then we see that and we start to think, oh, there I go again, I'm pushing myself too hard. Actually, the seeing of that is the catalyst for that recalibration. So it's not a bad thing. Actually, it is an incredibly important thing of finding that sense of inner balance. And similarly, when we're too loose and we're a little too sloppy, or we're not, maintaining our daily practice, or we're not doing whatever things we think we should be doing. And again, that recognition, seeing that, is just a sign that, oh yeah, that is the wisdom, the voice of wisdom in the mind. Oh yeah, I'd like to come back to something where I'm a little bit more staying true to the things that I value, and I want to make more time for this thing or that thing. So again, I think there's sort of a gentleness in the self-discipline. So rather than there being opposing forces, it's almost as though that calibration is an expression both of kindness and self-discipline. They're kind of together. Ideally, they should be really working together. So that's maybe how I would look at it. So we're just at the top of the hour. Thank you for those of you who have stuck with me for this long. If you want to have, actually, somebody mentioned Pema Chodron's books, and I would be completely remiss if I did not mention two, because Pema, I've read most of Pema Chodron's books, probably almost all of them. One in particular, when I read it, I went out and I think I bought like 10 or 15 copies and sent them to a bunch of people, was When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. That's another fantastic book. So anyways, I will end on that note, a great note to end on Pema Chodron, who's been an inspiration to me and to so many others as well. So if you want to just chime in, say a few parting words, I would love to know if anything stuck with you from thoughts you had for this past hour, insights or things that sparked your interest. If you want to put anything in the chat box, I can see so many of you will be here. So just to also let you know, we do this, there's things going on this channel all the time. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. We have some really gifted meditation teachers who are leading guided meditations multiple times every week. Antonia Simbundu, who's one of the Tergar instructors, is one of the most wise, compassionate people I've ever known. She's going to be giving a teaching next week. And of course, Mingyur Rinpoche, who is one of the great meditation teachers of our time, will be teaching regularly as well. So make sure you stay tuned here. Look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you so much for taking the time for joining me tonight. I hope we cross paths again soon. Take care.